Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Open Peer Review, Essential for Reviewers. I'm Melissa, Marketing Executive at F1000, and I'll be here to provide any technical support in today's session. So before we start, I will cover some webinar housekeeping. First of all participants will be muted throughout the webinar, but please do write your questions in the questions box, which can be found on your GoToWebinar control panel, which looks like the image on this slide. Our presenter, Joe Kelly, will be answering as many questions as possible during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. However, if your question isn't answered today, we'll be in touch with you shortly after. Also, if you need to drop off the webinar for any reason, the session is being recorded and will be sent to you shortly after. I will now pass over to Joe Kelly, who's an Associate Editorial Assistant at F1000, and who will be covering everything you need to know when reviewing openly. Joe, you are on mute.
Apologies there, sorry. I had to refigure out how to unmute myself. Yes, thank you very much, Melissa, for that housekeeping. Yes, as you've just heard, my name is Joe Kelly, and I'm an Associate Editorial Assistant F1000 Researchers Peer Review Team. And today I'll be providing an overview of the open peer review process at F1000 and its potential benefits for reviewers in terms of our structure. In terms of our structure of today's webinar, I'll first run through a brief overview of the different types of peer review, before moving on how to look to look at how peer review functions at F1000 research specifically, and finally explaining how open peer review and the works and the support of F1000 and editorial team, and how we look to bring about good quality constructive peer review reports. There'll be an opportunity for questions at the end of the talk. Before we start off then, a bit of an introduction as to what F1000 Research is. As you can see here, F1000 Research is an open research publishing platform for scientists, researchers and clinicians. We offer rapid publication of articles and other types of research outputs, which I'll go on to explain a bit about later, without editorial bias. And this is really where the role of open peer reviewing comes in, as I'll explain. As all articles on F1000 Research are peer reviewed after publication by experts in a range of academic fields, and that is where the judgment is made on whether the articles in question are of good scientific or sort of academic quality. F1000 Research's history is kind of in biomed and STEM publishing, but we're increasingly branching out into a series of other disciplines, including engineering, medicine, social sciences, and the humanities. With that in mind, it would be useful to get a sense of where everyone who is attending the webinar today, what their sort of research specialties and focus are. And Melissa is going to run a quick poll for us, if that would be okay.
Joe, can you also see it?
I can't see the poll. 1 second. Oh yes, I can see the poll on audience view. Great, thank you very much, Melissa. So what we're asking is what your subject area is. The options that you have are natural sciences, engineering and technology, medical and health sciences, social sciences and the humanities, or other. This might be helpful in getting a sense of how to tailor the question and answer section of this webinar, but also it's also useful for us in general to know who are the types of researchers and reviewers you might be engaging with F1000. So if you could please indicate your answers of that poll, please. Okay, so we've got quite a mix, mostly natural science focused, but also people from engineering technology, and also quite a few social sciences and humanities people. Good to have that blend there, really, and it's interesting to think about, and we might get into this in the Q&A stuff when I've done the overall talk about the different approaches or differences considerations we might have to take for different areas. So thank you very much. So moving on then. Basically, let's start off with a brief introduction to peer review as a concept and the different types of peer review. As I'm sure you all know, peer review is a central pillar of good scholarship and a necessary step in quality assurance for disseminating research. And publishers have been for well over a century sending out articles for peer review. Any legitimate publisher will always do their best to ensure an article is thoroughly peer reviewed to make sure that it is indeed good quality research. Now, while peer review is a standard, you'll see a lot of variation in the way different publishers try to deal with this aspect of the publishing process, and increasingly so with the onset of the internet, better access to technology, and the open access movement. So there are a number of different schools of thought on the best way to ensure that the process is fair to both authors and reviewers, but also ultimately to the readers as the end users of research and the people who are often in traditional publishing are kind of left interpreting the results of research articles without maybe some of the context of how the decision was made in terms of why that research was published and deemed acceptable. And that's something that we'll get into in a little bit, I suppose. But the variables mostly boil down to two things: what level of peer review information is made available to readers. As I just said, traditionally readers get very little information out of the peer review, other than the fact that an article has passed peer review and that's why it has been published. But it's not clear if there were objections raised or if there was a disagreement between reviewers. All that is kind of kept behind the editorial wall, as it were. The F1000 differs quite greatly from this model and quite novelly from this model, really, in that all our peer review information is made available to readers. That includes the text of the peer review reports, but also the names and affiliations of the peer reviewers. The other factor that or variable in peer review reports is the level of blinding available. And blinding in peer review, for those who aren't familiar with the term, refers to who knows whose identity, and that can range from triple blind, which we see in the slide here, which is very rare. They're more common in the humanities and social sciences, where the editor doesn't know the author or reviewer's identity, the author doesn't know the editor or reviewer's identity, and the reviewers don't know the editor or the author's identity. This does occasionally lead to, and I'm sure some people may have come across this or be aware of anecdotally of this, people occasionally being asked to review their own research, which is obviously something that we'd like to avoid. In double blinding, which is, I guess, the traditional way that we go about peer reviewing, the editor knows the author and reviewer's identity, and the author doesn't know the reviewer's identity, nor does the reviewer know the author's identity. And occasionally you also get single blinding, where the editor and reviewer, the editor knows the author and the reviewer's identity, and the author doesn't know the reviewer's identity, but the reviewers do know who the authors are. And then the F1000 way, where there are no external editors and the editorial team know the author and reviewer identity, the authors know who the reviewers are, the reviewers know who the authors are, and the readers know all this as well, because it is all published online. The different schools of thought are basically related to different concerns surrounding peer review. I suppose blinded peer review is because reviewers are unlikely to know who the authors are. It's harder for them to discriminate against them because of gender or ethnicity, or for competing interests to play to lead to deliberately harsh reviews. So there is, like, you know, sort of a very good reason for blinding reviews in that kind of formulation. But it is worth bearing in mind that blinding can sometimes fail. Authors and reviewers should never really rely on anonymity alone to lead to good quality and constructive peer reviews. Someone might recognize the author's writing style, or it might be a very small field, or the author's article may give clues to their location. It's also worth noting that in this blinding and behind kind of like the editorial wall approach to peer review, it's not always clear if there were objections raised to the research before it was published. On the other hand, in non-blinded peer review, people, I would say, I am a non-blinding advocate, so I will sort of declare that, obviously, working for F1000, people do tend to be more constructive with their discussions and suggestions, and this is something that myself and the editorial team work to ensure when we are publishing peer review reports, because every peer review report that comes in on F1000 needs to be of publishable quality, and we'll go into that later. And there is the benefit, and I will go on to talk about this benefit, of signed and affiliated reviews, really allowing peer reviewers to take credit for the work that they're doing. So to quickly move on to a second poll, I could run that again, is the question of, having introduced those different types of peer review, what type of peer review are you most familiar with? It'd be good for us to get a sense basically of whether open peer review is an entirely new idea to people or something that they've heard of a little bit. But mostly, yeah, what is the type of review that you've come across most in your research careers so far? Sorry, that's flipped button. Okay. And the options there are single-blinded, double-blinded, triple-blinded, open peer review. Yeah, double-blinded is the most common, over 56% of people having come across it. Interesting that 4% of people have come across triple-blinded. I wonder if those are humanities scholars. And yeah, it's nice to see that there is some familiarity with open peer review, but I do recognise that this is quite a new approach, and that's something that we'll talk through the rest of the webinar. Okay, so I guess before going in depth on how peer review works at F1000 research, it's also worth giving you a sense of how the model works in general. So basically, the big headline thing about peer review at F1000 research is that it happens entirely after publication. As this slide demonstrates, unlike traditional closed access journals, articles are published before peer review is carried out, and our editorial team carry out pre-publication checks that mostly relate to data availability, whether the submission fits one of the many article types published on F1000, and making sure that all ethical approvals for the research in question have been carried out. We at F1000 Research subscribe to the FAIR data principles, and we want all research data to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And these are part of what our pre-publication checks are about. They're not about the quality of research, which is something that might go on at other more traditional closed journals and might involve an academic editorial board, because as mentioned previously, we don't really have those. An article then runs through the production process, typesetting approves, correct, and making sure that the figures are all correct, things along those lines, which is very traditional for any form of publication. But then once it's published, that's when the peer review process begins. And so the article is published quickly to ensure that the research is out there for people to look at and for use in their own studies. And we then solely rely on peer reviewers to critically evaluate each article to ensure that the research and the data is as valid as possible. Basically, we're looking for the reviewers to decide whether this article is good enough to pass peer review. And it's going to be very clear to users, to readers, to anyone who comes across the article, that how that decision has been reached, how two reviewers or more have come to the decision to state that this is valid research and good practice. To ensure that the most qualified reviewers take a look at the article, we also operate an author-led approach. Basically, we believe that authors who are experts in their field will also know the best people in their field to review their work. And so authors suggest reviewers or approve volunteers, and volunteers are very useful to us at F1000 Research, who have expressed an interest in reviewing their article. This is partly because, we as an editorial peer review team, whilst we do have some subject expertise across a range of different academic disciplines, we're not an academic editorial board in the traditional manner. So authors can make a the first point of call for who the experts are in their field are. What we do as an editorial team then is run thorough checks on all our reviewers, such as looking at their expertise, looking to confirm their expertise, whether they've worked with the authors recently, and other criteria, which I'll set out on the next slide. And we also invite reviewers on the author's behalf and keep the authors updated about their article at every step of the way. So in the peer review team are really an intermediary between author and reviewer of the paper. So what we're looking for in peer reviewers at F1000 Research, and this is the criteria that we apply to all our peer reviewers, is that reviewers are qualified, and they should typically hold a doctorate or an equivalent publication in the area of research that they're reviewing in. Though obviously there are some papers that might be published on F1000 Research that might be based on like kind of in industry where someone might not necessarily need to have a PhD, and we are willing to take sort of consideration of those special circumstances, but most of the time we're looking for a PhD, MD or equivalent qualification. We want them to be experts, not just in the subject, you know, someone can have subject expertise, but also active. Reviewers really should be publishing regularly over the last 5 years on the relevant topic, mainly to show that, you know, they are actively engaged in the research community. They should be impartial, so that not only means that they shouldn't have collaborated closely with the author in question. We also consider shared institutional affiliations to be collaborations. We also, of course, pay attention to any other potential conflicts of interest. For example, work with pharmaceutical companies on papers that are relevant to that sort of area of research. And we do ask all reviewers to provide a conflict of interest statement if we believe it is necessary, in which they declare any potential conflict of interest and also confirm their ability to review impartially. We also encourage authors to suggest geographically diverse reviewers, and in our best working practices, we try always to get reviewers affiliated in different countries assessing a paper. Basically, we do so because, you know, we believe, and kind of tied to the sort of transparency values of F1000 Research and our global values, that good research should be assessed within the eyes of the wider international research community. And it also encourages authors to look a bit outside of their immediate research networks. This is again where volunteer reviewers can be very useful for global reviewing, as it allows us to suggest potential alternative reviewers to authors who are struggling to think of anyone who maybe they don't have a conflict of interest with, or they can only think of reviewers, they're only aware of people working in their area within their own country, even though there is a much wider kind of like global research community. You'll see the asterisks there next to qualified and expert. Obviously, often we do get requests, or PhD students might be interested in reviewing for us, or people who are just starting out, early career researchers might be interested in reviewing for F1000 Research, and we are happy to support that. But what we often like to do is suggest that they review alongside a more senior colleague, or often a principal investigator. In that allows us to assure the authors that the person reviewing the article is like sort of fully qualified, or like, you know, kind of make sure that we're holding to firm standards alongside qualification, but also provides a great opportunity for PhD students, ECRs, to really train up in peer reviewing. I know recent studies have shown that a lot of PhD students ghostwrite reports in more traditional peer review journals and don't receive credit for it, as a way of training up for being peer reviewers. But by co-reviewing, these individuals are able to actually get credit for the work that they are doing. So that's the criteria that we look for in all our peer reviews, whether they're suggested by the authors or by volunteers. So how does the peer reviewing actually work, and how do we make sure that a article is thoroughly and clearly peer reviewed once it's being published? Well, each reviewer who agrees to submit a peer review report gives the article an approval status, which you can see here on the right. And we have 3 statuses: approved, approved with reservations, or not approved. Basically, as you can see here, each status is explained. And approved basically means that a paper is good to go. It's of academically sound quality. There might be minor improvements to be made, but it is ready to pass peer review. Approved with reservations suggests that there might be a small number of changes that should be made. Maybe the underlying kind of research is sound, but it could be made clearer, or there are some questions that remain around the method, things along those lines. And a not approved suggests more fundamental flaws in the paper that seriously undermine the findings and conclusions, and that something serious has to be done about this particular article. I would say, though, that a not approved should not be confused with a rejection. As we'll make clear, or as I'll talk about within this webinar, every article that is submitted or published, sorry, on F1000 Research, it's kind of a living document and can be revised to meet the concerns raised by reviewers. So a not approved can become an approved if the authors revise and resubmit. So as well as assigning a status, authors write a detailed report of both the strengths and weaknesses of the article, and we request they answer some mandatory questions which change depending on the article type, and I'll talk about that in a bit. As our peer review process is open and transparent, all reports are published alongside the article and are displayed in a box like this. So it will show the status awarded, it will show the name of the reviewer, their affiliation, and then it will show which version of the article they are reviewing. Generally, we aim to get 2 reports per article, ideally from different countries, as we've said, to get multiple perspectives on the work. And then once a paper has been awarded 2 reviews of whatever status, that's when we kind of usually consider a paper to have gone through the first round of peer review. Now, if it has received 2 approved statuses, at that point it has passed peer review, and at that point it's he won't be inviting any further reviewers. The paper is considered to be of appropriate scientific or academic quality, and it will be indexed into relevant scholarly indexes such as Scopus, and there are a number of other scholarly indexes that F1000 Research articles are indexed into once they have passed peer review. If a paper still hasn't approved with reservations or are not approved after 2 reviews, this is when we will generally encourage the authors, not generally, this is when we will always encourage the authors to respond to their reviewers, any questions that they've raised, and basically they will have the chance to respond with detailed comments of their own, but also to provide a new version of the article. And it's at that point that authors are invited to re-review an article, and that's where the status that is awarded to it can change. So as you can see here, in this example, a paper has passed from having an approved and approved with reservations to needing a second version, and then it's got a second approved. We don't ask people who have awarded and approved the first time to review new versions, because usually they've signed up on everything. Obviously, they are welcome to if they do wish to see the new version of the article. A paper can also pass peer review if it has 2 approved with reservations and 1 approved. This might happen if 3 reviewers accept an invitation to review a paper, or occasionally papers get free reviews if we need a tie-break review, or things along those lines. If you don't have an editorial board, you can kind of make that decision in the same way as some traditional journals, and again, it allows that decision making to be very transparent. It is very important, obviously, given that we publish the articles before they're peer reviewed, that we make it as clear as possible to authors, reviewers, and readers the peer review status of the article. And we do that in a number of ways. So as well as having this peer review box that runs alongside an article and provides access to the reviews for readers, the title of every article on F1000 Research contains the version it is, so how many different versions of their article that has been, and its peer review status, how many reviews it's received and what status were given to it. This is also included in the citation, as we can see here. One second, as you can see here. And that's just to make it as clear as possible when an article, what reviews an article has received and whether it's passed peer review. If an article, for example, was on its first version and had not approved, that would appear in both the title and would appear in the citation. Articles that haven't had any reviews yet are marked as awaiting peer review. So it makes clear that there are no peer review reports have come in, and this is something that we're very keen on. The overall goal of peer review at F1000 is to ensure that it occurs openly so that readers can see what has occurred, that peer review validates and improves the article, and ultimately that peer review happens in a fair and ethical manner. So obviously the vital people to make that happen from our perspective are the peer reviewers themselves. And given the central importance of peer reviewers to F1000 Research, it's worth discussing the benefits to the reviewers. First and foremost, reviewers are able to get proper credit for the scholarly work of producing a good quality peer review report. And good quality peer review reports in many ways are a research output in their own right. They often contain insights that would be of benefit to the wider community, and help contextualize and explicate why the research being assessed is of a good quality standard, why it deserves to be disseminated. So, of course, F1000 research recognizes this fact by making all peer-reviewed reports have the name and affiliation of the reviewer in question, but also it's important to know that since they are research outputs, all our peer-reviewed reports are citable and discoverable through their own DOIs. So they're not only tied to the article themselves, they can be cited as individual, like kind of research contributions. They do have a digital object identifier. It also allows reviewers to work collaboratively, and contribute to the wider research discussion by assessing other scholars' work or working across cross-disciplinary boundaries when co-reviewing. Basically, given that peer review is a central part of research dissemination, is often seen is seen as a key part of scholarly and scientific practice. It's a good way of demonstrating that you are actively engaging in that by openly peer reviewing. And of course, as a key part we got about, you do receive credit for the work, and it is something that is citable. This is no longer kind of like insights and contributions that are locked behind a paywall or an editorial board decision. Finally, and it is the case, as is the case with most open access publications, F1000 research requires article processing charges. So there are fees to publish what is originally, which I don't really deal with from an editorial perspective, but reviewers on F1000 research do get a 20% discount on if they go and publish their own research on our platform. So that's kind of a fringe benefit on top of the scholarly benefits, but people are interested in open access publishing more generally. This is a way of, kind of like further engaging with the model, I suppose. This is just a kind of a testimony in terms of the value that authors often see around this open peer reviewing. And we see here Kevin J. Black, who's published quite a lot on F1000 research, pointing out that authors who publish on the platform are open and aware of the fact that they may receive criticism, that they may receive rigorous criticism in the process of having their work openly reviewed, and that's actually kind of welcome, and that it can help. Ultimately, it leads to better, higher quality research. At this point, I'm going to go on, I suppose, and talk a bit more about the different types of research that we publish on F1000 research, and also what goes into making a good quality peer review report, and the work the editorial team does in supporting that. So there are a huge amount of different types of research published on F1000 research. Obviously, the type of research output that I think we're all most familiar with across disciplines is the standard research article. But as a company, as a publishing platform, we're very committed to the idea that as much as possible, all different varieties of research output should be able to be made accessible to the wider research community, and that also they should be quality assessed through peer review. So we also look at method articles, study protocols, software tools, systematic reviews, and as well as the types of articles listed here, we also publish open letters and policy briefs. These relate to a wide variety of different subjects. We also publish medical case reports. And of course, the thing to bear in mind as a peer review editorial team and as a peer reviewer is that each different type of publication is going to need to be assessed in different ways. Obviously, a research article has different expectations of a method article. A medical case report has different expectations of what will go into it than obviously a software tool article. These are often actually very different type of publications. So as well as finding experts who are familiar with that type of research output and are working in that area, we at F1000 Research try to provide as much help as possible in terms of setting out what would be in a good quality and constructive peer review report, and that's where the mandatory questions that I talked about earlier in. So each different type of research output has to be assessed differently. And when submitting a report, reviewers are asked a specific set of questions tied to each article type. We see an example of some of the different questions here. Generally, there's about 4 to 6 questions per article type, so you're just seeing a sampling of them here. These serve not only really to make sure that the article is assessed fairly and that people are, for example, expecting fully detailed results in a study protocol or things along those lines, to make sure that there's no confusion about the type of article that is being assessed, but they also provide something of a guide to reviewers about what actually might be expanded upon in the main body text of a good quality peer review report. What's going to be most useful for both the authors and the wider readers to know about, both in terms of like a report that's an approved. It's useful to know what an article has done well and how exactly it's done it well, but also for, I guess, often more crucially, for approved with reservations or not approved to a certain extent, and certainly from the author's perspective, to know exactly where this research might have fallen down and what could be improved. And so our mandatory questions, which are included on every peer review report and are published alongside them, are a good way of addressing that. Now, whilst we tailor the mandatory questions associated with a peer review report to the different type of article, what we do hold for all of our reports is that they should follow our peer reviewer code of conduct, which is based upon some code ethical guidelines, and is basically just in line with kind of everything that I'm saying here, meant to make sure that that peer review here is as useful as possible to everyone involved. So we want peer reviewers, of course, to read the article fully and in their review kind of demonstrate that that's the case by being able to summarize it, provide examples of what they're talking about, be thorough, discuss the article as thoroughly as possible. Make specific comments which can be addressed by the authors and draw towards specific issues, and specificity is something that we will kind of push for as an editorial team when we're talking to reviewers, when we're kind of feeding back to them about their reviews. We do think they can if there are broad comments about the methods being inadequate, for example, in a article, it's always good to have a specific example to point towards, because that also gives the author something to address, and that ties into also being constructive with the criticism. We want peer review reports to be rigorous. We want we want authors to be held to a high standard, but also kind of all criticism should be fair, should be constructive, and this kind of this alongside avoiding insulting or derogatory tone is something that helps us have an open scholarly discussion that everyone can benefit from. And that holds basically across all articles published on F1000 research. And the flip side, in terms of all the responses to reviewers, should also follow these guidelines of engaging fully with the review, being respectful, etc., etc. So this, I think, is a good example and a good time to think about the different, to show kind of how the system fully works in action. We can think about the ideas of how a good peer review report, or how F1000 Research's peer review process works when it's at its best and everyone's engaging with it fully. So I'll just flick through a few examples here. 1 second, flip that there. So here we have, in fact, actually, let's start with a research article. So we have a research article here on linguistics. And as you can see, so we're on the actual website now. And so, as you can see, we've got the title, and we're looking at the version 1 peer review report. So this is an approved with reservations. This article, the review starts with quite a detailed summary of the paper, and then goes into quite a lot of depth. Now, not all peer review reports need to be this long, but this shows a real clear engagement with the research that is going on here. Here we see the mandatory questions. So for research article, people were generally asked if it's accurately presented and cited the literature, the study design is appropriate and technically sound, are sufficient details and methods and analysis provided to allow replication, if applicable, is the statistical analysis and its interpretation appropriate? And obviously, not every article is going to have statistical analysis in it, but that's a question there for those that do. And are all sources of data underlying the results available to fully ensure reproducibility? This is again related to those FAIR principles. Finally, the conclusions drawn adequately supported by the results. Reviewers, all references made by the reviewers are also attached to the review. Again, this means that the scholarship in the review itself can be followed up. Here we see that no competing interests were disclosed, and we ask reviewers if they want to declare their expertise. And this is particularly useful maybe on interdisciplinary articles where you might need reviewers from different backgrounds to have a look at the review. Now, as we can see, there is one response from the author to this review as well. And here, rather than a point by point response, we've got the author informing them that they'll send a revised manuscript. But often we also see authors giving full point by point responses. This article then went to a version 2. And the author, when reviewers approve a version 2, or if they approve a version 2, we don't always expect them to write a full-blown report, because at that point they're mostly just signing off on the changes made by the reviewer. By the authors in response to the reviewers. But yeah, they generally then provide a short report. We also, looking back, have an example here of a medical case report. And again, I guess similar sort of thing, good scholarly practice here, where there's a bit of a summary of the case, and then a bulleted list of where improvements need to be made, where clarifications need to be made, full list of references, which we always like to see. And then upon re-review, they have approved the report. And what else would be useful to see? Method article for biomedicine as well. We have quite a few people working in the STEM area. And yeah, we see, for example, here, an example of a good quality approved report, which, rather than, as you will occasionally see in some other open access papers, someone just simply saying this is good quality research, this is quite an in-depth discussion of the manuscript and pointing out a few minor points that might be addressed. Finally, let's have a look at this one, the systematic review. Again, nice, very thorough. And there's all the opinion article as well, because I think this has a very good example of the reviewer response. And so, yeah, we kind of also, in best practices, and this is what we're really looking to encourage, is a full-blown point-by-point response from the authors to the reviewers. And really, this is often the sort of thing that would be hidden behind the editorial process. The wider community wouldn't have access to. People wouldn't be able to kind of see the discussion that's going on here. Very edifying for all involved. And that's kind of like the ideal of how this should play out. So those are a few examples of how it will look in general. And one of the big benefits, I think, of F1000 research is, especially if you're an early career researcher, you've got a huge amount of resources in these peer review reports as to what a good peer review report looks like. And it's often hard to get a look at like peer review reports in traditional journals. So they're all available online. I encourage people to have a look through the platform itself if they are interested. And it's a good sense of like looking at this quite fruitful scholarly discussion. At the same time, then, as well, and kind of I've intimated throughout the webinar, whilst most volunteers on F1000 research are suggested by authors, we really heartily welcome volunteer reviewers. And volunteers, as long as they meet all our reviewer criteria, are welcome to review to volunteer for any paper of interest to them on the platform. All we ask is that they provide a CV and fill out a volunteer form explaining what type of article they're fit to review. And if reviewers do spot a specific article they'd like to review on F1000 research, just let us know and we can approach the author on their behalf. Also, you may get invited if an author is struggling to find a suitable reviewer for their papers. One of the editorial team may get in contact to ask if you are interested in reviewing a certain paper that fits within your research expertise. And there'll be contact details at the end that allow you to get in contact about this sort of thing. Also, all the slides will be available as a handout. I've noticed that I've been going on for quite some time here, so I'm happy to hand it over now for any questions that people have.